So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get the bezel strip sized, and what I do is I just take the strip, wrap it around the stone, mark it, and then use my shears to cut it to the right length. And then I make sure it's all nice and flush, and then I need to solder that joint together. So sometimes the solder is really tricky. So what's happening here is there's a little piece of solder. I put it on my pick. You can't see it, it's off camera. Don't worry, you'll see lots of soldering here in a minute. And so I'm trying to get it off of the pick onto the bezel. So that's why the pick is super hot. And you'll see this little ball of solder about to sit onto this bezel wire. Eventually, some days it just doesn't want to cooperate. And so once it's on there, then I need to heat it. And of course, this one's just flipping around. So you can see that little pool there. So that's the solder on that joint. And I actually had to go in and add a little bit more. That was a finicky little soldering joint. So once it gets all done, then I need to make sure that it's nice and flush because you've got these two edges of silver meeting together. And so I go in and I file it to make sure. Sometimes I have to go in and add a little bit more solder to make sure it's nice and solid. And so I get it to the point where I know that that joint, that seam, is going to be completely closed and not visible. So I go in with my file and I do it by hand, and that's what's happening here to get it to the point where I know that you will not see that seam. And that's where we are there. Then I can move on to the next step. And the next step is getting that bezel, so the side bezel, onto the back plate. So I cut that piece, that rectangular shape, off of a big sheet. And you can see that blue, that is the flux. So that is what's going to allow the solder to flow. So I get it to the point where it's kind of solid, and I heat up that back plate a little bit, and then I put the solder in. So you can see that those little balls in there, that's the solder. It takes a long time to get that in there, to get all of those in at the right spacing. And I find that when I do that with the solder that it's wet, they're just going to jump around, and I have to reposition them. So you can see that the back is going to start changing color. So it's quite red, and now it's going to silver. I'm heating from the bottom because that's protecting the bezel wire so it doesn't get too hot and melt, and because the back plate is just a bigger piece of silver. So then once it gets to kind of that color, then I'll bring the heat in from the top, and then you can see the solder flowing there. So it gets red hot, and you can see the solder has flown underneath the bezel and come out on the outside, and that means that it's a nice solid joint. So I let that cool down and make sure that everything is solid. If I have to go in and do a little spot soldering, if there's a spot that got missed, I'll go in and do that before I move on. So in this particular piece, it's a flush setting. So the back plate and the side bezel are flush together. And so I need to remove all of this extra silver. You'll see a lot of my pieces, you see that back plate a little bit. And so I will either use the handsaw, which I'm using here, or shears and just cut around. But I find the handsaw is just a little bit better when you're trying to do it flush. You can get in there nice and tight. I angle the saw away from the bezel so that I do not run the risk of nicking the sidewall. And sorry, the camera is kind of focusing in and off of the moving saw. This is a very time consuming but kind of peaceful once you get into the rhythm of it, but it takes a while to handsaw around the piece, and always just being really mindful and very careful not to hit that bezel. So I cut out a big chunk of that as we're coming around here. These flush settings actually take longer because you can see that there's these extra steps to make sure that it's completely flush. If you leave that back plate on, the piece doesn't take quite as long as when you have a flush setting. So these minimalist settings actually take longer to finish off. So once I get it all finished and the back plate is, the extra back plate is removed, that you'll see here in a second, it's very jagged, it's very rough, and so you need to remove all of that. So I'll start often with my Dremel with a sanding option just to get some of the like the sharp corners and get, you know, some of that back plate a little bit closer to the sidewall. But the majority of what I do is with a file. And so you can see that line there. You can see where the back plate is not quite flush to the sidewall, so you can see that seam, and that needs to get removed. So this is a very time-consuming part of the process. A lot of people just kind of skip this in their videos because it's not glamorous, but it is one of the most time-consuming things. Probably the most time I spend on a piece is filing and sanding. And you can see I'm sanding, I'm filing, I'm filing, I'm filing, and it doesn't look like it's doing anything, but it is very slowly removing silver and getting it to the point where you do not see that white seam there. And so eventually we'll get to the point where I can change the file over to sandpaper and get it, and that's where we are here. So now you can't see that joint, and I'm just going in. I like to do all this before I put the ring band on, before I put the bales on and all that. It's just easier to work with it without extra stuff. Now this is a ring, so we need to do the ring band. I didn't show taking this wire, it's a half round wire, I didn't show it forming it around the ring band to create the band, but that is a step. But I do need to close it up. So that's a little piece of solder in there and need to heat. So basically when you're soldering, the whole piece of silver needs to be at the same temperature. So that's why I'm kind of going around, and then the solder is about ready to flow. You'll see it just kind of pull out. There we go. And so that has now flowed, but we need to make sure it goes into that joint. So keep the heat on and then flip it down, and then I'll always do it from the outside, and that's going to draw the solder through that joint and make sure that it completely closes. Then I need to file and sand and to make sure that that seam is completely flush. I don't show that because I've already shown doing a lot of filing, but this is a critical step. Once I'm ready to put this band onto the back plate, it's a half round wire, so if I don't do this part, it's not going to be as solid. So I'm taking my file and I'm creating a little bit of a flat spot so that this ring band is going to sit a little bit better. So now you can see that blue, that's the flux, and you can see that solder bouncing around. So as I say, I like to always kind of get the solder or get the flux to this more solid stage before I put solder down. But with a ring band, I like to make sure that there's solder underneath that band. So here in a second, I'm just going to reposition that piece of solder to get it a little bit more centered. And there we go. And so you can see I can kind of move that into the center. Now this takes a while, so I just have a hand butane torch. If I had a big propane torch, this part would be a lot faster, but I don't. And so again, all of this silver has to be to the same temperature. So it takes quite a while with one of these little guys. You actually aren't going to see the solder flowing because, of course, the torch gets right in the way of the camera. But you can see it's flowed there. So that's all done. So now probably the most exciting part, but also one of the most stressful parts, is setting the stone. So once you're at that stage, you need to be super careful. You can go through all of this work and get to this stage, and if you're not careful, if you crack the stone, if you break the stone, then all of that work was for naught, because this setting is for this stone and this stone alone. And so I always make sure I'm not too caffeinated and well rested before I do any setting. So I basically take my tool. This is a flush setting, so that means that the silver's not coming up over the top of it. Like when I do the serrated edges and things like that, you run higher risk of breaking the stone, but still you want to be careful. So I take the tool, I make sure it's nice and flush. So I'm just kind of putting pressure against the side. And then you'll see here in a second, I'm going to take this tool and I am going to start rocking it up towards the front. And then that's where you could potentially crack the corner, chip it, or something like that. So you just take your time, you work around the stone and just work around, make sure everything's nice and tight, make sure the stone isn't moving in the setting. You want to make sure it's nice and solid, and just move it around and get it to the point where it's super, super tight in there. And then once I have that at that stage, you'll see I'll kind of come in here and I might use a file if I find I want to kind of file that edge and make it a little bit more flat, or sandpaper, depends on the setting and what needs to happen. But this little setting tool can leave little tool marks on the silver. And you can see in this stage here where I start kind of using this, it'll just kind of change the color of the silver a little bit. So I'll have to come in with some sandpaper here in a second and just get rid of any little tool marks or any discoloration on the silver and get it back to where it needs to be before we do the final finishing. So I'm just doing that final little, really lots of pressure in there just to make sure it's nice and tight. Then the sandpaper comes out, final sand, and that's what this is here. I don't think I used a file on this one. I think I just used super fine sandpaper that's really worn, so it's just almost like a light buffing pad. So some sandpaper, and then I'll come in, and in this case, you can see my thumb is there, so it's protecting the stone from any abrasion. You don't want to scratch the surface of the stone. And then I'm going to come in with a polishing pad. That's what this is. And that's just going to, you can see it just kind of shines it right up, brings it to that final finish, and do a final polish on the band and on the bezel. And then it's all ready to go. So just final little polishing up here, and the piece is ready to go to its forever home. And that's it, all done. It's a size that fits me, so I had to kind of try it on. So that's a sweet little rectangular wild horse, and that's it all finished. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.